Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries, and this is our Matters of Fate, creating a setting in Fate demo. And I've kind of been joined by Dave, Ian, and the Chief, who have agreed to help me demonstrate the campaign creation methodology in the Fate core book. Now, none of us have any advanced prep for actually creating this campaign setting. We're literally going to pick up the Fate core book here and we're going to go through it step by step just to see and demonstrate how useful the campaign creation method is. If you just gathered a group of people around with no real prior prep, would it actually be possible to create a workable campaign using just this method? So if I can ask everyone to unmute themselves, we'll jump straight into this. Okay, so right guys, so to take you through it, the synopsis of the campaign creation method that's in the Fate core book is, first of all, setting. We decide what the world that surrounds the protagonists is like. 2, scale. We decide how epic or personal our story is going to be. 3, issues. We decide what threats and pressures, what sort of plot elements are going to exist in our game world, our campaign as we start it off. 4, NPCs, who the important people and the locations are in this campaign setting. And 5, skills and stunts. We decide the sort of abilities and powers that people in the setting would have, and after that would be normally when you go on to character creation. Now, for the purposes of this demo, we're literally just going to be doing the campaign creation. Now, a few things to bear in mind, guys, before we start this. The sort of holy trinity that are outlined in Fate core when it comes to campaign creation are proactivity, competence, and drama. And just to bring that very simply sort of back down to earth, characters in Fate games are expected to interact with their campaign world. The campaign mechanics, aspects, stunts, etc., they all reward characters who actually jump in and get involved with plot, rather than sort of some games that encourage players to maybe sit back a little bit to be a bit more considerate. Fate's a game of action and a game of consequences. Also, when we come to competence, characters in Fate tend to start off with a certain degree of competence. It's not really a game where you start off playing a sort of level 0 peasant and eventually scale the mighty heights of arcane power over the years. It's a game where you already start off being very practiced and very good at what your character does. And finally, we come on to drama, and this basically just sums up what we've already said. Characters in Fate core, Fate Accelerated, and the various other Fate games, they should have very dramatic lives. There's always something interesting occurring to them. After all, it's the interesting bits of their lives that we're interested in playing out in the session. No one wants to play the hero when he's sort of sat down reading his newspaper in a cafe, has a nice dinner, and goes home. It's the important bits when he's being heroic that we're actually interested in playing out. And that's one of the reasons why I've heard a lot of people say that Fate is a very good system for high action, sort of slightly less realistic games, because it models that competent, dramatic, and proactive style very well. So, okay, so I'm literally going to pick the book up here and we will go through it. Okay, so the first step in setting up a Fate game is to decide what sort of people the protagonists are and the world that surrounds them. So, first of all, we're going to talk about the setting, and we'll move on to the protagonist later, or rather we would if we were doing the full setup, because that's actually part of character creation. Okay, so first of all, we need to decide what the world that surrounds the protagonist is like. And this could be anything. It could be inspiration from a movie, inspiration from fiction, it could be something you're interested in. For instance, you could say, oh yeah, we're looking at a futuristic world, or you could say, oh, we're looking at a world modeled on feudalistic Japan, or you could say, oh, I'm interested in organised crime, so it's going to be a sort of mob-based setting. So, what sort of ideas would you like to throw forward, guys? Has anyone got any ideas for what sort of genre or setting you think would be a good thing for our protagonists?
Yeah, I rather fancy what setting particularly, but I rather like horror.
Okay, so the first suggestion is horror. So I'll note that down, and obviously when this is broadcast, I'll have the note sort of appear at the side as we're doing this. For Sheaf and Dave, do you have any sort of thoughts on horror, or whether any ways that could be expanded to make it a little bit more specific? Obviously, horror is a very broad genre.
I mean, I think if you're going to expand on the horror, you could say more like a film noir kind of setting, so a dystopian past sort of thing.
So a dystopian horror.
Okay, so we can work with that. So film noir, obviously, a lot of the time tends to go very much sort of hand in hand with the sort of detective slash sort of gumshoe style of game. Now, obviously, that's not always 100% the case, but certainly in the common perception, it's very much linked in with that sort of, the sort of the windy big city with like the rain drizzling down, everything in a sort of black and white, and there's normally some sort of hard-boiled detective behind the scene. And this handily leads us on to our second point, which is how epic or how personal in scope is the game going to be. Now, in a small-scale game, you're talking about dealing with like the problems in a single city or a street or maybe even a building, whereas at epic scale, you're talking about sort of potentially the whole world, the galaxy, maybe even the universe being the stage upon which the game takes place. So, for Sheaf, for this sort of film noir dystopian horror that we're doing, what would you think in terms of the scale?
I'm imagining a very small scale, because with horror and film noir, I find it very hard to imagine, the grand scale version of that.
Yeah, I do think
it's easy.
Yeah, I do think it's very much easier to convey the mood of horror if the setting's on a more sort of personal level. Because as you say, it can be quite easy for details and for the horror to get lost when you're sort of painting with like the broad strokes that you need to use on a really sort of epic scale game. Works really well for some sort of genres like space opera and stuff like that, but perhaps not so well for horror. I mean, even if you look at sort of H.P. Lovecraft, which is ostensibly sort of cosmic horror, the actual stories themselves, the true sort of like cosmic horror element was only revealed at the very end. The actual stories dealt with the sort of personal journeys and sort of, I suppose, damnation and fall of the protagonist. So how about yourself, David? Yeah. Would you say that you were happy with a more smaller scale game? And if you are, what sort of scale are we talking about? I mean, are we talking about a street, a building, a city, or a suburb?
You probably get away with setting it, I'd say, around a block in American terms, because they are fairly large scale. I mean, we compare them to our streets, and they're minuscule in terms of our street versus their blocks. So I think that gives you enough sway to move it away from one area, but we essentially still keep it in the same sort of context.
So we're talking about a sort of like American-style city block where, as you say, you've got a bit of room to like maneuver. You've got a few sort of different like neighborhoods, so you can still have changes of scenery, but it's still very much sort of confined. There's like a set border around.
Yeah, you're still sandboxing it in, aren't you? So.
Yeah. I was going to say, in terms of it being set on a city block, how would the game actually sort of be maintained in that small city block? Because obviously, with a city block in any sort of larger city, there are other adjacent blocks, etc. If we're looking to keep our game confined to that city block, at least at first, is there some sort of external factor or something that's keeping people in that block. And this handily moves into sort of stage 3, which is where we determine the setting's big issues. And the way we do this is we come up with current issues and impending issues. Now, these will all be turned into setting aspects which can be compelled or invoked by anyone at any point during the game. They're always there, although they can change. Current issues are problems or threats that exist in the world already and possibly have been there for quite some time. For instance, that like a corrupt regime or like an organised crime family who've like ruled the city forever, or a generations-long war, or some of the examples that are given. And we also have the impending issues. These are things that have only just started to rear up in the setting. They're the sort of problems that have only just started to occur. So, for instance, if you're running a zombie apocalypse game, the actual sort of zombie apocalypse itself, it's only just started to, if it's only in its initial stages, that will be an impending issue.
Yeah, I think the horror aspect could probably be that that impending issue. If the game starts out it's sort of not exactly mundane, but not as horrific, and then the impending issue is as things start to fall apart. Not necessarily a zombie apocalypse, but maybe something else.
Okay.
Something more sinister.
So we're looking at the main sort of horror issue. That's not a problem. I'll make a note of that. The other thing we need to consider before we get into like the actual sort of nitty-gritty of deciding what the issues are is the number of issues we want. Now, if I look in the book, the default number is 2 issues. Now, you can have like 2 impending issues or 2 current issues, whatever you want. But the way it says it here, you can change that number as well. You can tweak it up or down, but that does change the resulting feel of the game. A game with 1 issue revolves around literally just that. It's a very focused, sort of narrow beam game. Like if the whole game revolves around a single quest, that might be a 1-issue game. Whereas a game with like on the other end of the spectrum with like 3 or more issues is going to be a very, very busy campaign world with potentially a lot more different things going on and potentially a little bit more fuzzy when it comes to the actual focus of the game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, since obviously it does give people more to do and more to look into, but it also means that the game won't be quite as focused on a specific set of issues. So does anyone have any thoughts on how many issues? Are you happy to go with the default 2? Do you maybe want to go for just 1 and have it be very focused, or would you like to broaden that slightly and go with more issues?
I'd say 1 or 2.
Okay.
I don't think you
2.
want to be like overwhelmed by too many things in a horror game.
Okay. So if we stick with the default of 2, that means we have 1 current issue, which is a problem or threat that already exists in the game world. Now, I'd say if it's going to be a horror setting, and we've already said that the horror is going to be an impending issue, that perhaps the current issue might want to focus more on the slightly sort of, not mundane, but more on the slightly sort of normal problems that exist in the setting, which we've already got a few sort of possibles with it being sort of based on film noir and it's very dystopian. So does anyone have any ideas for the current issue that might exist in the game?
And you want this to be the more mundane one?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but since we're going for the sort of the horror coming from the impending issue, I think it'd be a nice contrast to have the current issue be more sort of a mundane threat, I suppose.
Perhaps we could link that to how we want the characters. So if they're confined to this block, perhaps they're members of some organisation, not necessarily the police. But with it being like a gumshoe thing, maybe they're all part of a detective agency.
Okay. So if everyone's happy with that, I shall scribble down detective agency. Obviously we're going to define these slightly more later on, but I'll just scribble that down for now. And then we come to the impending issue, which we've said is potentially going to be the horror of the setting. It's something that's just started to occur. So we're looking at a setting where, even though it's dystopian, it's not actually horrific, and the campaign's going to start just as those horror elements, those sort of unsettling, those less natural elements start creeping into the game. Does anyone have any idea for what form this horror, this impending horror, might actually take within the game?
Perhaps like a dimensional incursion or something.
Were you reading my mind?
Right.
I was thinking that as well.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay, so we're looking at some sort of dimensional incursion, and I've just jotted those down in my notepad window. So the next thing, now we've decided on a couple of issues, is we need to make these issues into aspects that can be used within a Fate core game, because they can be used by anyone at any point during the game, and although they may change, they're always there, and as with all aspects, they're always true. We're not going to go into a massive load of detail about what precisely aspects are. I'm assuming we all know that, and it's been detailed in the companion video that go with this. So just to jump into it, we basically need to think of a way that we can represent these as aspects. So Dave, if you're going to represent the detective agency as an aspect, the fact that the players belong to some sort of detective agency, what would you call the aspect in question?
I mean, you could go with like a foundling organisation.
Okay. And would anyone care to give our foundling organisation a name?
It'd be something Inc. Anyway.
Okay, something Inc. Okay, would anyone care to venture a name for the actual incorporated company that all of the player characters belong to?
Magic Eye Incorporated.
Magic Eye Incorporated.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like it should have the word "I" in there.
Okay, I like that. It makes a lot of sense, given that presumably you guys are trying to track down or in some way present this dimensional incursion that we've already discussed. So if you, just for a random extra thing, to help define this organisation more, if you guys had to pick a motto, you know, our detective agencies always have like a motto or their sort of credo. If one of you was going to pick a motto for your detective agency, what would the motto be?
You can always find help here if you really need it. Something like that.
Okay, so what I will do is I will say that the aspect is Magic Eye Incorporated. You can always find help here if you need it. Okay, there we go. And that's an aspect that could be compelled or invoked by anyone at any point during the game, which is the whole "you can always find help there if you need it" is great for compels, since at any point that could be compelled to say, oh, someone else has turned up at the detective agency looking for help. So that's absolutely grand. We now move on to the slightly darker subject of the impending dimensional incursion. We also need to decide on an aspect for that. Now, bear in mind that it's an impending issue, so I'd suggest it be a slightly more sort of subtle aspect, because the aspect can always be changed to reflect like the ramping up of the dimensional incursion later on in the game.
Yeah, so there's like some sort of leak or a trickle initially coming through from this other dimension.
Okay, so
How about?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say, since it's this idea of a slow trickle, we need an aspect that basically says that odd things have just started to happen, but that somehow suggests this dimensional incursion.
Okay, so I was thinking maybe the nature of the dimensional incursion is similar to Silent Hill: The Room, where this man is trapped in his apartment and there's like a hole in his bathroom and it gets bigger and bigger and it leads to the horrible place of Silent Hill. So
Yeah.
Okay, so how would we represent that in terms of a small statement that defines how that's affecting the setting? So obviously it has to be affecting the setting in some way that you guys are going to interact with it.
How about the door is ajar?
That's an interesting aspect. It doesn't really. I think it could probably be tightened up just a little bit. It's a bit general.
Yeah.
Well, you could go for the classic crack, couldn't you?
Sorry, what was that, Dave?
The crack from Doctor Who, where it shows the other side and what's happening, and it's getting bigger as time goes on.
Okay. So how would we represent that in terms of like a statement that we're going to use in an aspect? I mean, I suppose you could always go for something like the things have started leaking through from the other side or something like that.
Yeah. Like we did the snakes on the train where we had the hole with things passing through it.
Okay. So does anyone have any thoughts as to how that could be phrased, or are you happy with things have started to leak through from the other side?
I'd say that's fine.
Okay, I'll write that down.
Ooh.
Go ahead, the chief.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say, like, should it sound more mysterious?
If you've got, I'm quite happy for it to sound more mysterious. Have you got any suggestions as to how you think that would be best accomplished?
So, well, it would depend where the crack is, but I was thinking if it's in someone's apartment, you can say something vaguely ominous, like there's something strange and going on in apartment 66.
Okay, well, how about we combine the two? How about we say there's something strange going on in apartment 66. Things have started to appear, or perhaps even things have started to disappear. I don't know how you feel about that, because that suggests it, and it gives a nice location, but we've still not just sort of pushed the whole story out there from the get-go. It still leaves a lot of room for expansion and development.
I like it.
Okay, I'll write it down. Down as there's something strange going on in apartment 66. Things have started to disappear. Since I was thinking that perhaps things have started to fall through this hole, and that it
Could be people have started to disappear.
Indeed, because that'd lead to your detective agency being drawn in, but obviously with no idea where they're going, and perhaps eventually something's going to take notice of the fact that all of this stuff started appearing and go, oh, it's all coming through that hole, I wonder what's on the other side of it, and then you've got your whole dimensional incursion angle as things start coming back out of it. Okay, so we've made those into aspects. What we do now is we need to drill down onto what we consider to be the important pieces of our setting, whether these be locations or NPCs. And what we do to do that is we look at the issues, the aspects that we've just created, and then any that we think sort of suggests an important location or an NPC, we make a note of them and we give that location or that NPC a single aspect as well to basically describe them.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the main ones would be Magic Eye Incorporated offices.
Indeed. I'll just write that down. Okay, so if you were going to describe the Magic Eye Incorporated offices in like a single sentence as a sort of descriptive aspect, how would you describe the offices?
Busy, well organised. Spick and span, I guess, because we've got a cleaner or a secretary who keeps everything really neat and tidy, and keeps things ticking over.
She works for free because we helped her out.
Well, I was going to say that's actually an excellent example of how the sort of drilling down process works, because you mentioned you've got a cleaner and a secretary there, so it's easy for me to just note them down, and if we want to define them slightly more, we can. And the chief's already started doing that by saying the secretary works for free because we helped her out. So as part of this process of drilling down, we can now say, well, how did you guys help this secretary out? What did Magic Eye do for her that's led to her working for free?
Exorcism.
Okay. It's nice to see that Magic Eye Incorporated's diversifying their portfolio. It's always
Magic Eye Incorporated. Yes, we perform exorcisms.
Yeah, like I said, we've got a priest on the books.
Who was it that you guys helped to exercise for this woman, this secretary?
Perhaps a daughter or an aging mother.
How about her schizophrenic older sister, and it helped calm her down that one time?
Okay. And then we could continue the drilling down process to the nth degree. You can basically keep this process going as long as you want. As we've just said, we've now discovered that Magic Eye Incorporated has got a priest on the payroll. We could move on to define him. We've got the elder sister of the secretary. We could go on to define her. And you can keep this drilling down process going as long as you want, basically. All I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to note down the presence of the priest and the elder sister. Before we get too much into defining that. However, there's also other things that we need to define within the game. There's other elements that we could drill down into a little bit more. Obviously, we've got apartment 66, which has been mentioned in the impending aspect that we've got. We could perhaps drill down into that a little bit more. At the minute, we don't know anything about the actual person who owns apartment 66 or where it's situated. So I'm just going to scroll down apartment 66, and for Chief, if you had to come with a single sentence to describe it, how would you do so?
Fantastic. Well-furnished apartment, fantastic location. You can get it cheap because there's a long history of the occupants disappearing under mysterious circumstances. That probably needs to be cut down a little bit.
Okay, well, the easiest way to do that is we can put like well-furnished apartment in a fantastic location, but it has a history, because then it's very easy to drill down even further and say, well, what is the history of the apartment? And you can link it up to something else and assign. In fact, let's do that now. So I'm going to put with a history. So what I suggest we actually do is I suggest we have like the apartment building in a fantastic location with a history. We can then do apartment 66 separately if we assume that the history is focused around that apartment.
Mm-hmm.
So Ian, what would you say is the the history of this apartment building, in particularly focused around apartment 66, that means it's such a seemingly amazing deal for anyone looking to get on the property ladder?
I suppose it could be the potential contacts that are also living there. There's a lot of high flyers, so there's a big clique and plenty of opportunity to mingle with high society.
That's more of a positive sort of reflection of the apartment building, which
I thought that's what, yeah.
We can write down, since that would be part of the fantastic location, why it's so good. But if we're talking about the history that maybe means it's not actually quite so desirable, we're leading more into the sort of horror element here, particularly focused around apartment 66, which would appear to be the nexus of the horror that's occurring, at least as far as our campaign's concerned. What would you think that could be?
It's quite simple that the people leave out.
Yeah, I like that as an aspect. That's brilliant, because it very much implies people disappearing in this whole sort of dimensional incursion that we've discussed. But it's also something that can be easily put into a sentence, and it's got a bit more of the sort of the character of the setting to it. So that's a brilliant one. That people leave, but they don't check out. Okay, so basically that is the campaign creation method that is used in Fate Core, and in a relatively short time we've gone from having absolutely nothing, no details of a campaign, to coming up with this film noir dystopian horror setting that's focused around one city block and is based on the detective agency Magic Eye Incorporated, who are always there for people who are in need of help. The locus of the horror in the setting is focused around this huge apartment building, which once had high flyers and very social people, the rich and the affluent in it. However, recently people have started to disappear, and people have started noticing that although a lot of people check into the apartment building, particularly around apartment 66, people leave but they never actually check out. And not only that, we've also gone on to define some of the key sort of NPCs, the contacts that you could have at the start of the campaign. For instance, the secretary that you've got, who works for free since Magic Eye Incorporated helped to exorcise her schizophrenic elder sister. We've discovered that Magic Eye Incorporated have a priest on the payroll, and we've detailed out the apartment building and apartment 66, and this drilling down process could be carried on as far and to as great an extent as we wanted to. We could go on to say, right, okay, well, who are these high flyers in the apartment building? Who owns the apartment building? Who's the current tenant of apartment 66? Who are some of the tenants who've gone missing? And we could define all of that, and that's in the space of probably about 10-15 minutes without us having to roll any dice, and straight away we've already got what I think is a very interesting campaign setting there that you could potentially now pick up and say to the players, right, okay, let's run with this, let's create some characters in this setting, and you could jump straight into playing that. Obviously it would benefit a little bit more planning when it came to writing specific adventures, but if you were just doing a one shot, or if you're prepared to put in a little bit more behind the scenes, I think that what we've created would be a very interesting and certainly very workable campaign setting. I don't know how you guys feel about it.
Yeah, definitely.
When are you running the game?
Well, I did threaten at the start of this hangout that if the campaign creation did work well, I might actually run a one-shot in that setting. So what I will actually try and do for Sheaf, just for you, is I'll try and organise a one-shot involving Magic Eye Incorporated and their attempts to prevent a dimensional incursion via Apartment 66 at some point in the future. And when I do that, I'll put out a call for players, and hopefully some of you guys will be able to get in on that. It just depends on what my schedule is like. But basically, for anyone who's watching now this video, once I've edited it and put it up on the YouTube site, that is a very quick run through of how the campaign creation works in Fate Core, and it's pretty much the same in most Fate games, Fate Accelerated, Dresden Files, etc. They all have a version of this campaign creation, and it basically allows you to go from having very little defined at the start, and by this process of drilling down and defining different elements, come up with something quite interesting and unique to the group that you're playing for. So I think that's a very salient demonstration of how the campaign creation system works. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. Thank you very much to Dave, Ian and the Sheaf for taking part in this hangout and demoing the campaign setting, and hopefully I will be able to run a one-shot set in the dystopian world of Magic Eye Incorporated in the future. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Yep. Cheers.